Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. I'll be presenting alone, but with me are two research assistants, Sylvie Lachapelle and Ms. Croteau, who are next to me, and they're also responsible for what I'm being presenting. As you can see in my profile, I'm specifically interested in applied research, having with a direct link to the setting practice. I'm a practitioner, I almost do exclusively research. So my thoughts today come from one of these experiments. So the child's best interest and policies conducive to improving health-related quality of life for children at risk. With the Eastern Township Center, we put together a project which focused on their needs in an institution which is also based on the outcome of previous research that I had conducted. So quickly, these committees are not decision-making committees, but they're advisory bodies. We don't make the decision. We don't have ethical committees. We don't make the decisions. Rather, we help professionals in making their decision, all within the view of respecting the best interest of the child. These committees live by and for professionals. They are not estheticians, rather they're professionals who assist other professionals in thinking about the point together. And it is thanks to this thinking that we're able to focus together on the interest of the child. So we're going to change the tone of what we've been discussing up until now, is that we're taking for granted that accompanying children is one way of doing this, that it's accompanying professionals in their decision making, that we're able to appreciate the notion of the interest of the child. So in brief, we have very little time, but very quickly, what is the context in which these professionals work? The legal aspects, thank you to Mr. Ballas this morning who addressed this in detail. The ethical aspects, that's the path we choose to help professionals to give thought to this. And through illustration, we choose a very simple, concrete case. No doubt it's one of the simplest cases that we've been able to see in our work. So I'll be illustrating this, and then I'll conclude on a few observations. Today's purpose is to enable you to think and to allow you to leave with more questions in mind rather than answers, because that is what we like to do with the professionals as part of the project. It is a project in the Youth Center, and we are documenting all of the research to assess what the impact is of our accompanying them. So the general context, again, I don't need to remind you of this. You also work in very difficult settings. So we have characteristics associated with the families that we meet with. I say we, I'm still the intervener, but don't be offended when I say the we. On the other hand, you have the characteristics of professionals, the work that they must do with families and among families. So lesser evil situations where we have to take into account that the impact on the lives of children are very, very important. On a legal level, we spoke about the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. This morning we'll be talking about the Civil Code, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Youth Protection Act. These are all part of the legal framework. All decisions must be taken, all the while focusing on interest and rights of the child, as a result of which we have to account of the needs and characteristics of the child and its environment. So I won't be going through this principle and asking you to raise your hand, but nobody is against the principle of the interest of a child. That's a basic principle. It's a fundamental principle, and it's part of the decision-making. And when it comes to youth protection, there are some situations, some cases that are before the courts. And then the first thing we have to consider is the interest of the child. Where it becomes difficult is in the interpretation of this concept. So how do you assess or interpret precisely the interest of the child, all the while knowing that each case is unique? As a result, we're saying that the principle of the interest of the child is a generic principle, but that has to be enforced. It has to be adapted to each specific case. It has to be adapt to the unique characteristic of each situation. We've spoken a great deal about relationships, connection. It's always a bit surprising because when you work in a help relationships, that is your focal point. So we sense that we always have to remind ourselves of it. But if I want to assess the interest and the needs of the child, I must be in contact with that child and the family. And at that point, through the relationship I've developed with them, this enables me to understand the representations that the children and family make of their own situation. This enables me to assess their needs and there to conduct a more accurate analysis of the interests of the child when I make the decision. So how have we gone about working with professionals in their intervention and to shake them up a little bit? And it's through an ethical perspective. So voluntarily today, we have set aside the meta part of the project, but we're really focusing on the thought process. We want professionals to think about their actions. We also try to do it through dialogue. That is, we're using dialogue and ethics. So we're talking about applied ethics. It's not philosophical. And we want to ensure is that professionals can take a step back in making decisions, again, all the while to locate themselves with respect to the actual interests of the child. So 4 major questions we asked as part of this project. Because professionals present a case, and in our exchange, we try to bring our thinking to an ethical perspective and not to go to an operational level. So what need do I have to meet, including the fact that in some cases, and that's not voluntary, mostly we seek out to meet our own needs as professionals, or we're trying to meet the needs of our organizations and sometimes even some social needs. So which interests for which child, the idea of uniqueness, how do you interpret the meaning of the interest of the child for each of the interveners, that is the professional, the family, and sometimes this might also involve others, always with the notion in mind of how to act as best as possible, how to do our best for that child in that particular situation. As a result, it's necessary to develop a certain ethical attitude, and we'll revisit this in conclusion. And we have a reflexive reflex, but we also have the obligation, again, I emphasize and I say that it is absolutely an obligation to see the situations differently and to take a different tack on the decisions we make as a professional, because the representation game is very much present. In ethics, there is the notion of meaning. So how do you read into a certain situation? What meaning do you give it? It also depends on where you're located vis-a-vis on to the different actors and how we represent ourselves. And yesterday, I believe somebody raised this issue, but should decision-making be based on representation, only the one from the intervener, without validating this with the family? So it's very important to identify meaning and the notion that the professional builds the problem as well as the solution within this intervention. We must ensure that this construct of the problem, and again in quotes, but that the construct of the problem is done on a solid and fair and justified basis. Now, the trap is that we make decisions in a setting of lesser evil, because unless you're in a situation, you would not work with a family. So in a situation of lesser evil, we must conduct an analysis of the situation through this ideal filter. That is what is known to us, what we know about our own representations of what they should consist in. This could be a major trap for us when we make a decision. In terms of the method that we have chosen to, when we say we, both the research team as well as the environment, this was all part of a co-construction setting. What we chose to do is to use ethical deliberation. What does this mean? To think, to use thought, but to also focus on ethical concerns in order to develop a sensibility to the consequences of an action. For those of you who are interested in this, I could send this to you, but I'm not going to review each of these categories. But there are, in fact, 4 different perspectives that we look at: the identity side, the organization, its structure, the law, and society and its imperatives. And first, people are going to identify what they see in a situation having to do with each of these perspectives, but specifically the interrelationship between these different perspectives in order to identify zones of tension and paradox. And I'm going to try not speak too quickly. So here's an example. It's a simple situation, but in actual fact, it wasn't quite so simple. This was a woman who was in a mother-baby center, and she suffered abuse at home. Her 2 other children were already in a foster home. She wanted to return to her husband. The baby was placed in an emergency situation, and we then after evaluation, it was noted that the parental skills were very limited. The dilemma was this: the mother wanted to continue breastfeeding her child while the child was away from her, and 2 professionals disagreed. And the foster family is not comfortable with the situation as well. Just to give you an idea, based on these 4 perspectives that we've identified as part of our framework, the discussion might last some 2 hours. Here are the facts having to do with each of these perspectives. This is a basis for making the decision, but they are not enough actually to make the decision. Then, and I'm not going to read each and every one of them, but there were more. There was an exchange based on questions that are raised with the various professionals around the table so that we can push this further and that we can look further at the facts and that enable us to validate all of the representations. And the purpose of the moderator is to play the devil's advocate in order to enable the professionals to take the necessary step back to well assess the interests of the child. In this particular case, we really quickly realized that the professionals were making their decisions on the basis of their own personal values and due to social pressure having to do with breastfeeding, that this is the best thing for the child. We had to push this somewhat further so that we could truly justify this in light of the interest of the child. So the outcome and proposal, I know things are going quickly, but this is a preliminary analysis. We're pursuing the project. We've been doing this since June 2014. It will continue until June 2016. Unfortunately, we've noted that a dominant discourse with respect to the interest of the child as part of this discussion. And the discussion took 40 minutes before somebody raised a hand and said, well, what about the interests of the child in all of this? So there has been a moving away due to many factors. It's not due to bad faith. Sometimes it's because of the work setting, the representation of the professional mandate. But there are a number of determinants in practice and a decision-making process that moves us away from the interests of the child. So it's a matter of interpretation, how, in fact, to properly assess the child's interest if we don't have contact with the family and if we don't properly represent its true needs. So it's important to conduct the exercise of locating it properly. We spend a lot of time in discussion justifying the interests of the child without focusing and trying to determine exactly what we're speaking at more specifically. So taking a step back, it's often very difficult to move away a bit. Nonetheless, it is a complicated exercise for professionals to be facing a colleague and to be discussing a case where we're not too certain about how to act in order to respect the interests of the child, and more specifically when there is youth protection involved, where there is pressure to intervene quickly and to do the right thing, and we're dealing with an involuntary context, and often there are other constraints that are imposed in most of the cases. So many justifications require difficulty in stepping back, and the observation we've made is that professionals have to be able to be shaken up. One mustn't stay in that situation, of course, but they have to be able to see something differently. So they must be able to move away, to allow themselves to be shaken up, and to leave aside certainties that they usually have in mind and we must be able to found ourselves on past experiences. 3 other points, the operational trap or operationality trap. So a lot of what should be done in the here and now, although we know that we have to put all of this into perspective against a larger backdrop for the child, a lot of tendency to affirm rather than to think through, and finally a focus on a decision rather than focusing on the process. So what we've noted is that the process is often much more important than the actual decision in such a case, whether or not to allow breastfeeding to continue. In the committees, that actually has very little importance to the extent that professionals are able to identify why they side with one or the other option and why they validated all of these representations with the family. So in conclusion, we have to move from the what to do to how to do it for the best. And in order to achieve this, one must better accompany professionals in their decision making, because of course there is going to be a red light that is pointed out, a flag, because if we justify their protection interest based on the interest of the child, and unfortunately in the day-to-day intervention we actually move away from this, there's going to be a problem as far as we're concerned. So to better help professionals in their intervention. And if I were to do yesterday's exercise in the elevator, where I'd spend 15 minutes with a minister or a leader or one of our directors of our new health and social services centers, if I had 15 minutes to spend with them, I'd like to show them that when you invest in these kinds of projects, which are quite easy to carry out, when you invest in small-scale projects in order to come up with thinking, we also help children in the day-to-day realities. So we move from the legal aspect to the ethical aspect with respect to the interest of the child, but I think it's important to retain that we also have to focus on the interest of the child in order to act as best as possible. And this small-scale project is trying to set the stage so that we can cultivate a change in attitude and mindset of professionals when it comes to their decision-making. So this is the end of my speed presenting. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that this will further your thinking.